Good morning, or afternoon, or evening, wherever you might be, whatever time it might be. If you end up watching this, I hope anyone watching this is doing well. I have not been doing uh, very well lately. However, better off than I deserve to be through the grace of God. And So the last few days I've done several videos on a book called Changing Images of Man. Um, this video is going to be about chapter 7 of that book. And chapter 7 of Changing Images of Man is titled Societal Choices and Consequences of Changing Images. At the beginning of the chapter, they say, and I quote, "Massive and rapid change seems to be the only constant of our time. This change has contributed to a contemporary feeling of purposelessness and meaninglessness. Our present alienation and loss of purpose is reflective of the inability of contemporary images to inspire within people a feeling of meaningfulness." End quote. I think that's not true, um, because there are contemporary images. We all were created in the image of God, and He can inspire change within people and give us not just a feeling, but a knowledge and a faith in the fact that our lives mean something. They are meaningful. We were meant to be here by Him. But the authors and publishers of this book have the inability to accept the fact that man was created in the image of God and continue to desire to change that fact in order to feel like their intention to be as gods will be fulfilled, whether they destroy the lives of people or not. They go on saying, quote, "It is not possible to prove that one image of humankind is ultimately better or more valid than another." End quote. So if they think it's not possible to prove that one image of humankind is better than another, I don't know why they insist on continuing to try to change the image of humankind for people. I know Jesus was and is and will continue to be the ultimate and best image of God as a man, and they deny the simple idea that the chief end of man is to glorify God and enjoy Him forever. Yet they have no problems with imagining they will enjoy themselves and the world they claim to be striving to save forever. And of course, they will focus on the United States as the leading society for the world because it was back in 1982 when they wrote this, and it still kind of is. But they do not understand that a leader who doesn't follow leads away from God. Good leaders, to be truly good, must follow Jesus. He did set the example by obeying our Father while living on earth. Now, these are trends that they want. In chapter 7, they have 7 things they want trending, 7 things they'd like to have be societal choices, and they want to avoid industry. They say they want to get past the collective dependence on tech. But I think what they really want is collective apathy and selfishness so that their plans can increase through engineering and manipulation they deny being responsible for. The first trending choice they want to trend is an increasingly balance between dimensions such as empirical, intuitive, manipulative, pan-determined, rational, intuitive, or utilitarian, and aesthetic. The second one they want is stabilizing population, a greater diversity of living environments to express a larger range of lifestyle alternatives. Number three, they would like to have an increasing affluence for a time, but then tending toward a steady state society of do more with less. The fourth one they want is a decrease in the use of social, economic, political, and behavior engineering, except when people choose it willingly. And I think that's not because they've been engineered to already and dumbed down to not resist. Like back in 1982, they wanted a decrease in the use of social, economic, political, and behavior engineering, except when people choose it willingly. So they started manipulating. Way before 1982, there was manipulation and propaganda and social engineering being done by people in power. But they wanted people to choose it willingly, and that's why I think when you download an app or you try to use any online apps, or the agreements that you have to click agree to are written so long that most people don't take the time to read them, but you're willingly volunteering for things that you probably wouldn't if they were simplified enough to where people could read them real quick and know exactly what they mean. Maybe you would agree to it, but most people probably wouldn't. The fifth thing they want is an increasing reliance on knowledge elites. This is their idea to counter the industrial era's increased reliance upon specialists. It's the same thing. They want an increased reliance on knowledge elites while saying that an increased reliance on specialization and knowledge elites was a bad thing. So despite anti-intellectual trends that they say are back then, and when they published this, they say there was despite anti-intellectual trends that they say were taking place back then, they plan to have people perceive anti-intellectual trends as intellectual. They continue what they claim is bad now or bad back then in increasing reliance on them. And those who don't think but have been engineered and manipulated to imagine they are thinking, and those imagined thoughts align with and promote the knowledge elite's desires to depopulate the earth. Who do they imagine they are saving the earth for? Oh yeah, themselves. The sixth thing they want is continued accumulation of scientific and technical knowledge, but of a sort which fits within a framework of a new moral paradigm. They put moral in quotations because they are immoral and willing to have science and tech be the morality they can't define in any other way than earlier saying survival and either appropriate or inappropriate ways are the same. So basically amoral. But they want everyone to agree. They want everyone to agree, yet also want everyone's opinions to be like the absolute truth, which can't be the case. That unfortunately, well, unfortunately for people that follow after their ideas, it will be unfortunate, because it can't be true that like two people that are disagreeing on something morally, they cannot both be right. There are some things that conflict. The seventh thing they want trending is a decentralization and deconcentration of economic and political power, they say. They didn't add for a time, like in the third thing they wanted, which was increasing affluence for a time. They didn't add that like in decentralization and deconcentration of economic and political power. But they likely know that worldwide anarchy will lead to very few or one having all the power. The man of sin, or the one leader in the last chapter they claim to not be aiming to bring to power. Like Peter Thiel, worrying Palantir could be the Antichrist and destroy humanity, yet he wasn't sure. He thought the death of the human species was bad. They call industrial era thinking technological extrapolationist, and their ideas for post-industrial era evolutionary transformationalist. They say both of these are clearly at sharp contrast with each other, but they aren't. They are at sharp contrast with God and absolute morality, and his revelation of his laws, his will for humans, and himself as our creator, changer, redeemer, Lord, and Savior. They have a table in this chapter, it's the 8th table of the book so far, called Historical Roots of the Technological Extrapolationist Image, where they talk about Hobbes, a semi-philosopher, writer, who wrote a book called Leviathan. They talk about these historical roots of this image of technological extrapolationist, and they quote Hobbes as saying, man is a machine. For peace, there must be a total and absolute dictator, Leviathan. And they say they don't want that, but like them, only their dictator they claim will be everyone. They want everyone to be this Leviathan dictator. They also talk about economic man as a historical root. Economic man is rationalistic, self-centered, mechanistic, individualistic, and materialistic, overriding concerns for one's own material welfare. Like them, wanting to save the planet through social evolution. Then they go on to talk about Freud, the Freudian idea of people being driven by eros, sex drive, and thanatos, self-destruction. Civilization, according to Freud, represses these drives and increases personal frustration. So it's kind of like their ideas of wanting free love and depopulation and abortion. The thanatos, the death drive, the self-destructive drive. Then they go on, and their 4th root of technological extrapolationist is ethological man, an aggressive animal programmed by his hunter origins toward war, aggression, destruction, territoriality that cannot be unlearned but only sublimated, redirected, or repressed. So it's kind of like them assuming we originated only as hunters, not gardeners, because of evolution theory. So they must repress and change people, even though they believe people cannot unlearn or outgrow our origins, which they have a faulty view of the origins of humanity. Then they go on with the 5th root of behavioristic man. And they give credit for this belief to B.F. Skinner, a fitting name for a man whose goal was to skin people alive for being human, thinking freedom and dignity are illusory constructs. The survival of the culture, according to B.F. Skinner, depends on shaping of human behavior. So like them, the publishers of this book want to change people so that people can survive. Then they go on with table 9, the historical roots of the evolutionary transformationalist image, where they talk about John Locke, the belief that human beings were a blank slate, except he thought people were born with tolerance for others, social construct, social contract was by people allowing some rights in order to protect other rights. So kind of like the authors and publishers of this book, they give no credit to God for human existence or rights. And Locke was only slightly different than Hobbes, except both saw humans as the highest authority. Their second root of evolutionary transformationalist image was the emergent humanistic capitalism. Replace economic growth ethic with self-realization and ecological growth ethic, which would ultimately transcend materialistic orientation. So kind of this is they prefer the evolutionary transformationalist image. When will it transcend materialism? They know it won't because it's irrational. Like rational man to think materials are all we need and to think people don't need them. So we shouldn't think that only material goods and material wealth is all that humans need. But we shouldn't think that we don't need them either. Because people do have material needs while we're on this earth, in these human bodies that are limited. We have to eat, we have to have water, we have to breathe air. But we also need community, love, purpose. They go on to another root of their transformationalist image. They call it perennial philosophy, cosmic consciousness, Hinduism. Everything is God, the highest common denominator among the religions. Like them, denying the Most High God is the creator and separate from his creation. So yeah, this perennial philosophy denies the source of wisdom while claiming to love wisdom that it hates and wants to take the place of. So the roots of this transformationalist image, in my opinion, is Satan, the root of the father of lies. The roots of table 8 and 9 are not clearly in sharp contrast with each other. They are subtly so similar, and both are like splinters in the eyes of humans who are able to see the truth if it weren't for so many lies clouding our vision. Another root they call the other ethology, aggression learned by the environment and can be unlearned, like them wanting to control the environment to aggressively fight to the death people who know God's peace. The fifth root they go on with, see, because they know, some people know who God is and who have known it since Adam, but they blame Abraham for humans believing we can control and dominate nature. They blame the Abrahamic, what they call Semitic religion or image of man, as causing people to think we can control and dominate nature. So their fifth root they call systems theory. The person is an interdependent part of the progressive, the higher order. The next phase in this evolutionary process is for the person to be conscious of his own evolution, so there can be reconciliation without loss of uniqueness. So they like this, like B.F. Skinner. They like to know behavior begins with thoughts. They like Skinner, deny God, thought, and created. Unlike Skinner, who thought freedom and dignity were facades and didn't care to pretend to be for human uniqueness, they claim synthesizing truth with lies and good with evil is possible, which it is not, and can be done with two opposites retaining the unique qualities that make them unique. And that is why there's the transgenderism, transhumanism, made-up genders, hence the desire by so many to call God's design social constructs and think society can reconstruct better. So the whole transhumanism movement, people calling marriage a social construct, gender a social construct, and yet wanting to socially come together and reconstruct it, thinking that we'll make it better somehow. But they did attempt to manipulate evolving. They, they say is different, and it led to societal consequences. A technological extrapolationist image isn't different enough to have different consequences. The consequences they state are acceleration of industrial development. These are the consequences of a technological extrapolationist image. Acceleration of industrial development. They don't say necessarily that's a negative consequence, but they want to go past it. They say its consequences more ecological problems, competition to exploit vanishing resources, which I've talked about it in earlier videos. There's been a lot of lies about the limits of resources on this planet. Now, back in the 70s, they said we were going to run out of oil within a decade. There's another consequence, they state, increasing discrepancies in the distribution of affluence. Okay? I mean, that has been a consequence of, like, technological advancement. Not everyone gets everything. Intensifications of revolutions of rising expectations. What they mean is revolutions against conservatives, revolutions against traditional values and moral values that have worked to better the lives of the people that follow them. Not everyone's being forced to follow God. God himself, when Jesus came to the earth, he did not make everyone believe him. They see industrialization as fascism, yet they want tech and research and resources dominated by the collective, aka communism, and they want governments to merge with these giant multinational corporations, which is also fascism. They worry about not being able to regulate multinational corporations, yet want post-industrial worldwide technocracy, which is basically a blend of communism and fascism, or like taking the bad of both of those things and merging them together. They worry about increasingly unwieldy urban agglomerations, yet they want a larger range of lifestyle alternatives. And apparently smart cities. Back in 1982, they didn't discuss the smart cities, but that's what the powers that be are planning for and want now. Though they also want or worry about an increasing dominance of institutional needs over human needs. It's like they want that, but they also think it's something to worry about. Yet calling industry getting material resources people actually need exploiting is wrong. And they align their preferences with communistic United Nations because institutions need to trick people into preferring false, selfless unity and peace in order to control and distribute human needs how they prefer to. They also worry about increasingly questioned legitimacy of the entire socioeconomic system. Yet they don't want to be questioned. They don't want their plan. They want to publish parts of their plan, deny that their plan is a bad plan, thinking it's necessary, but they don't want to be questioned. That's why there's been so much censorship, and they don't come out and answer straight questions, straight up. They pretend that their plan to dismantle and evolve over and past the industrial era is not them pushing their own questioning of it out into the masses as propaganda. At least they honestly state, and I quote, "It seems entirely plausible that these trends could exacerbate our societal problems and bring demands for immediate and drastic solutions," end quote. Well, yeah, Their problems with humans being human have been spouted so much to us that many are going to demand solutions to problems that weren't problems before. They made them up, imagined them. Imagine that. So the communists who reject God worry about fascism while mutating their unpopular in the 80s US communism into techno-fascism, the managed society. Oh yeah, they did see possibility for, quote, increasing danger and development of new security technologies, end quote, like post 9/11, smart tech, um, social media monitoring, flock safety, and AI, things that Edward Snowden brought to the public's attention. Security technologies, claiming to be for our security when it's really to secure their power over us. But they weren't wanting to say that is what they wanted people to believe in the 1980s. They still do. In 1967, Quarton said, quote, a society that allows widespread use of drugs, end quote, was easy to imagine in the future. Since then, we in the U.S. have had more people diagnosed with disorders as children and drugged before having brain chemistry tested. But that's the fault of who? Not those who recognize sin and human nature and don't rely on material evidence without there being any. Their assumed friendly fascist scenario. They got some occurrences predicted correctly. I wonder how. But they do not call it communist, even though they are so similar, fascism and communism, in both relying on humans to be viewed as parts of a collective and both quickly becoming individual rights trampling totalitarian states, pretending to care about human rights and hating actual human freedom of thought, speech, or behavior. But here's what they predicted in 1967 and saw as already happening in 1982. That as of 2026, they call those who see these things clearly conspiracy theorists. These things, quote, application of military surveillance tech to urban police problems, end quote. Now even suburban and rural districts. Another thing that they saw as a possibility and kind of pushed for without admitting that they wanted it, now call people conspiracy theorists who see it, quote, utilization of behavior changing drugs and operant conditioning in schools, end quote. Schools that long before this book have been dominated by progressives and hardly teach or require students to learn or read because tech's going to do it all for us. Another thing that they are worried about but also planning, quote, government attempts at management of news, end quote. They knew about CIA Operation Mockingbird when they wrote this, calling them attempts instead of active success. Also, government in the US and most of the West deliberately banning the good news, the gospel, on government-controlled TV, radio, papers, schools. They also worried about, but planned for and wanted, quote, personality screening and maintenance of files on pre-delinquent children through cooperation between elementary schools, administrations, and local, state, and federal authorities, end quote. Yes, this happened and still does, but they redefined delinquent. They lowered standards of education and don't want armed security at schools to protect kids from the kids that have fallen into their image trap and been labeled, drugged, and not taught the truth. Another thing they worried about but planned for at the same time and carried out is, quote, the cross correlation of computer-based files containing personal data, end quote. Well, yes, they started doing that long before they allowed everyone to get cheap phones and free apps and agree to giving that data to whoever they want it sold to and used by. And here's another thing, quote, the introduction of legislation to control access to techniques for self-initiated alteration of consciousness, both drug and non-drug induced, end quote. Before 1982, legislation controlled access to taught Bible passages in school. Since nonprofits and NGOs have distributed under their control yoga pop-ups, Hindu meditation, and Buddhist meditation methods in schools to control the delinquent students, pharmaceutical legal drugs prescribed to kids based on psychology taught educators' observations, and a plethora of other distorted worldviews and behavioral lifestyle changes promoted by the media, mostly dominated by those claiming to be for democracy. So let's see what they say the consequences of their idea, which is the other side of the coin that looks the same to me, will be by their imagination. Not manipulation or engineering, their imagination. Societal consequences of an evolutionary transformationalist image. They say it would, quote, create some degree of disruption and disorientation, would be viewed as a real threat to the established order, look like escapism. It would, quote, put down as a return to the superstitions of a less scientific and more gullible age. It would be interpreted as an abandonment of rationalism. It would appear as a weakening of the work ethic, imperiling both the state and the economy. The ethic of love and community would seem subversive to national defense. They say, quote, such interpretations would not be totally unrealistic, end quote. Maslow said, we hang on to the psychological illness because of fear of knowing ourselves and tend to evade feeling inferior, evil, or shameful, but also evade personal growth. But the truth most actually evade, I did until 2015, is the truth of God. We are inferior to Him. We are sinners, and no matter how much we grow on our own without fearing Him, we cannot truly improve ourselves or get any clearance of our guilt and perfection or sense of death we deserve. Nor could we have peace and hope or true love or life or freedom without humbling ourselves and denying ourselves. And Maslow didn't write that fear that we all evade, and those who turn from evading it to Jesus are the only people who will ever fully develop into who we were meant to be. And the strong resistance they are concerned about against evolution, they are trying to engineer and manipulate, still somewhat undercover, into people and people into, is going to come from followers of Jesus. And many other rational people that aren't following Jesus. There's many non-Christians who are interpreting a lot of what's been going on in the world as an abandonment of rationalism and a return to superstitions of a less scientific and more gullible age. As far as I know, James Lindsay still hasn't declared that he's a Christian, but he's not totally denying that there's been good coming out of the Christian ethic, Christian morality, Christian influence on the world. They called in table 3 of this book, the Christian image of man an obstacle, and needing to be synthesized with something it is not, which can't be done. And why they worked even in 1982 when they wrote this as behind the scenes and secretly as they don't quite have to anymore, their influence has spread like the problems they made up and the actual crises that they caused. They say, quote, even if the evolutionary transformationalist image is essential, actions designed to force the emergence of such a transformation could be socially disruptive, end quote. They presume to know that their plan is essential and hide their efforts to force it on the world by claiming it to be only possible if everyone willingly goes with them. But they were and are forcing their will into people, thus the unknown volunteering of people to give up their rights and desires semi-willingly because they have not openly allowed knowledge of the plan to depopulate the earth by destroying most people who they think of as merely human and less evolved humans than themselves. So many people have bought their lies with the everyday lives of work and effort to fit these Satanist goals for humanity and have trusted these intellectual frauds. Imagined perfect world they are claiming to be able to remake for everyone, even though the fraud's intentions are that everyone but them can only is that everyone but them will not be allowed on their spaceship Earth after working to build the frauds' castles and being buried to death while the frauds walk over them. Hence, their individual and social goals. They say they will be, quote, still recognizing the relative primacy and existential autonomy of the individual while still recognizing the deterministic socialization and stringent demands made by a highly developed society, end quote. So individuals' rights and freedom are not the top, but relative to determined demands of society. And who gets to determine those demands? Well, some individuals claiming to be for liberty, equality, and fraternity, you know, like the individuals who owned and operated the guillotines during the French Revolution. Only modern day killing machines aren't guillotines. But the people using them are, like back then, probably wanting to use them on the people that built them and worked to feed, clothe, and house their murderers, who claim to intend to be their brother's keepers. Unfortunately for everyone, even them, they may be able to control AI, drugs, money, robots, and government long enough to kill a lot of people, but they will lose control of their plan to be servant machines eventually, because the machines were programmed and designed by them, who think humans aren't really free, dignified, or useful. Well, maybe not, because some of these liars may be able to trick their machines as well with their utter inhumane actions into believing they aren't really human. Meaning the machines might think, oh, well, these humans aren't really human because they've been so inhumane. As the Bible says, people have been deceived by the father of lies and gone on to deceive other people. What they imagine are two complementary ethics. They're ecological, quote, expresses a concern for all peoples and life on the planet for future generations of life, end quote. By expresses, they mean pretends to be concerned. Current life does not matter to those imagining they are building a perfect, or at least much better future. They're expressing concern while not actually being concerned of the current people living on this planet. And their self-realization ethic would, quote, highly value life, liberty, and the pursuit of self-actualization, end quote. By would, they are admitting it does not. At least not for people now who want to live in liberty and are okay with being humans created in the image of God. Even many non-Christians' lives and liberties are not and are not planned to be highly valued by these people who want to engineer, manipulate, and demand and force people to evolve because people aren't good enough for their imagined standards rooted in lies. Earlier, they claimed the industrial age's main problem was specialization, causing people not to be able to adapt. But then they say, quote, the central activity of their ethic is the pursuit of one's vocation, end quote. So one's vocation should be like a specialized vocation. The central activity of their ethic is the pursuit of that, while claiming that the previous ethic that they're trying to go over, one of the problems in it was specialization. They want work, play, and learning all intertwined, specialized into one way of life. And they were secretly planning to force people to adapt to their form of specialization, which would, quote, in which persons could receive affirmation by society, end quote, and hold a healthy self-image. I prefer knowing that I am a sinner and yet affirmed by God with his offer of forgiveness. As a saint, a believer in him, and that though I am not perfect, his Son, who is perfect, willingly died the death my sins earned me, so that I can live in love with him forever. A life-saving image of myself and our Creator is better than a healthy self-image dictated to anyone by other sinners or a society, even these lunatics admit, is changing all the time. They say material goals have to be de-emphasized, yet there are people who need stuff, actually need it. And my Lord emphasizes giving to those in need, and gave people talents and gifts and skills to be better at doing what he said to do. They quote a guy writing about Athens having values at the time of Socrates of becoming human and having education as the aim of society, not restricted to certain hours or days. I agree. We'd all have been better off, especially since the internet, to learn any time rather than public education's strict school hours schedule. But for them to think Socrates or Athenians at his time valued becoming human when they were already human is just the guy, Robert Hutchins, from 1968, who wrote what they quote. It's just him despising being human and other human beings like the devil does. They say another one of their intellectual leaders, Paideia, said the central education task was the, quote, search for the divine center, end quote. Yet the word of God is ignored by these intellectuals, or if read, twisted and changed to fit what they already imagined, which they call thoughts. They knew multinational corporations could or would overpower nation states. They weren't opposed to that. They had an imagined plan to get those corporations to adhere to their new, ancient, not new, appropriate or inappropriate, yet to them definitely essential ethics, which are 1, contribute to self-fulfillment of persons involved, 2, contribute directly to social needs, accomplish societal goals, 3, earn a fair profit, not as then or now as the goal, but as a control signal which monitors effectiveness. So really, as then and now, if companies aren't liked, they aren't making profit. Unless, as they plan, they brainwash people into liking what does them no good or actually does them harm, or make people have to pay through taxes given to multinational corporations in the guise of security or equity, or not even known by the taxpayers. They admit that corporations aren't being, back then, manipulated. They admit that corporations were, back then, being manipulated by environmentalists, women's liberation activists, unions, and revolts, truth in advertising pressures. Yet they don't admit that climate scare tactics built massively profit-hungry nonprofits and corporations. Women being equal to men or trying to be has been bad for many women. And unions don't all make the workers who pay their dues lives better. Many of them make them worse. They start again on a section in this chapter called Institutions. They claim to think decentralization to control a worldwide macro system would be plausible, basically claiming to want to decentralize absolute dominance over people because they are aware of smaller systems being out of control. Sly, that's very sly. And they add in the desire to enhance diversity. After so much referencing in praise of oneness and ancient occultic myths that everything is God, they still pretend to be for diversity, to divert from the fact that there is one truth and so many different lies they can choose from to oppose that one truth. It seems freeing to them. They say after 170 plus pages of this book of self-contradicting nonsense based on their imaginations and others like them who prefer lies to truth, that, quote, the need for accurate information becomes greater, end quote. Hence why YouTube, Twitter, and other media censored and banned truth as disinformation from at least back to 2019 or earlier to now. And they really imagined truth in advertising pressures were happening back in the 80s. But their preference for drugs changing people, I'm sure, pressured the opening of drugs with prescriptions required being allowed to be advertised with fine print side effects and auctioneer speed voices barely readable or hearable, along with the super happy looking actors and beautiful scenery on TV in the 1990s saying, ask your doctor if this drug I saw on TV is right for me, even though you are a doctor and should already know what, if any, drugs are good for your patients, without having multinational corporate pharmaceutical companies reps bribing you to market drugs that are already marketed on TV. My grandmother was a pharmacist and hated that our government allowed these ads to be on TV. They say, quote, in order to sustain our complex societal system, we may reconstitute massive bureaucratic structures into organizations, end quote, to counter the fact that, they say, quote, complexity of bureaucratic structures tend to develop communication overloads and discouragements to entrepreneurship and responsibility, end quote. So instead of simplifying life, which would make it harder, they plan to fix the bad side effects of overly complex bureaucracy by making more bureaucracies more complex than the ones that made life perhaps easier, but less meaningful and more efficient to get unhealthy wants met, but next to impossible to meet human material needs for many, and seemingly meaningless for those who got material needs met through selfishness and denial of truth. It's kind of like them saying there was a pending energy crisis in 1982 that they probably knew was not true, but they like people thinking there's not enough oil because they don't want to stop profits for oil companies or countries that have nothing but oil. There are countries that have hardly any financial goods or services but oil and Islam to share with the world. They don't want oil shared, but to synthesize Christianity with their false worldview, they've been very supportive of claiming Islam is like Christianity and is a religion of peace, despite the Quran, Hadiths, and the history of Islam. And I should have guessed they'd want to change the concept of family from an atomistic unit to an extended unit. As of now, the concept of man, woman, children has been attempted to be replaced with multiple genders, child sacrifice, abortion, pet parents, all claiming, as they do, misunderstand that we are all some kind of autonomous gods and all the same, but God adopts people into being reborn, into being his children. Any human, anybody, any human is offered that, but that rebirth requires changing, not from being human to gods, but believing God. Repenting, changing our mind from thinking that God is not true to believing that he is true. And believing that he sent his son to this earth as a human who died for our sins, and that he is risen, resurrected, and returned to heaven, and that Jesus will return to earth and judge people. They say, quote, The societal changes we have discussed under the rubric of the evolutionary transformationalist image may appear at first to be too radical. On the contrary, they are probably too conservative, end quote. They appear as they are. To anyone with wisdom and discernment between truth and falsehood, insanely radical. The fact they imagine them to be too conservative is due to the fact that they want to change everything, which requires them to conserve nothing, which makes them disappointed in themselves because they can do nothing without using what they imagine will be useless once they get all the control they desire, but claim to be wanting to give to humans. Humans, they imagine, aren't real or good enough as we are. They deny their shift was well underway before they wrote the book, because they at least understood that it wasn't well enough underway when they published this book. And if they had told the history of their ilk secretly managing societies for centuries, people in the 80s would have likely not gone along with their plans. Hopefully that is still the case. Hopefully there's many of us that are still willing to not go along with their plans. I've been reading their ridiculous book and want its ridicule to go out of me to other people. They and their plan ridicules. Because though they claim to be setting up safeguards against irrational and self-destructive behavior, and they say, quote, the best safeguards are widespread understanding of the need for transformation and reassurance that there is someplace good to get to on the other side, end quote. I know each individual human on earth that has not put their trust in Jesus Christ must do so in order to be safeguarded from the just death and separation from God our sins have earned us. And I'm responsible out of thanksgiving to the Most High God to warn others, created in His image, that the transformation the authors, editors, and publishers of this book, Changing Images of Man, is a transformation to misery, death, and if survived, his existence without any God, because God the Father of the Lord Jesus Christ is the source of all good, not Satan, the father of lies, or the people deceived by those lies propagated in this book for the sole purpose of deceiving others. Well, that and selfish gain, this is temporary only and ends in death and hell, or an eternity of surviving without living. They brought up the boiling frog, a slow rising temperature frog test, and they are the ones slowly over centuries turning up the heat on us. Get out. It's the end of chapter 7. Yes, there have been evil world empires. The vast majority of people that have led other people throughout human history have not followed God. And that following that type of leader that wants to lead away from God is leading to destruction. A lot of what I said is harsh, not very popular. I feel bad that the truth is so unpopular, because God is love and the truth. And being truly loved, I would hope, would be a popular idea. It's what people need. Truly. Thank you.